My name is Edward Feigenbaum. I'm a professor at Stanford University in the Computer Science Department, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to interview my colleague and friend from 1968 on, Professor Don Knuth of the Computer Science Department. Don and I have discussed the question of what viewers and readers of this oral history we think there are, and we're orienting our questions and comments to several groups of you readers and viewers. First, the generally intelligent and enlightened science-oriented person who has seen the field of computer science explode in the past half-century and would like to find out what is important, even beautiful, and what some of the field's problems have been. Second, the student of today who would like orientation and motivation toward computer science as a field of scholarly work and application, much as Don and I had to do in the 1950s. And third, those of you who maybe are not yet born, the history of science scholar of a dozen or 100 years from now, who will want to know more about Donald Knuth, the scientist and programming artist who produced a memorable body of work in the decades just before and after the turn of the millennium. Don and I share several things in our past in common, actually many things. We both went to institutes of technology. I to Carnegie Institute of Technology, now Carnegie Mellon University, and Don to Case Institute of Technology, now Case Western Reserve. We both encountered early computers during that college experience. We both went on to take a first job at a university, and then our next job was at Stanford University in the new computer science department, where we've both stayed from the earliest days of the department. So I'd like to ask Don to describe his first encounter with a computer. What led him into the world of computing? In my case, it was an IBM 701, learned from the manual, and in Don's case, it was an IBM Type 650 that had been delivered to Case Institute of Technology. In fact, Don even dedicated one of his major books to the IBM Type 650 computer. So Don, what is the story of your discovery of computing and your early work with this intriguing new artifact?
Yeah, okay, thanks, Ed. I guess I want to add that Ed and I are doing a team thing here, so that next week I'll be asking Ed the questions that he's asking me today, and we thought that it might be more fun for both of us and also for people who are listening or watching or reading this material to see this symmetrical approach. Instead of having a historian interviewing us, we're colleagues, although we work in different fields. We can give you some slants on the thing from people who sort of both have been there, and we're going to be covering many years of the story today, so we can't do too much in depth, but we also want to do a few things in depth, because that's the defining thing about computer science, is that computer science plunges into things at low levels as well as sticking on a high level. But since we're going to cover so many topics, I'm sure that I won't sleep tonight, because I'll be saying to myself, oh, I should have said such and such when he asked me that question. And so I think Ed and I also are going to maybe add another little thing to this oral interview where we might want to add a page or two of afterthoughts that come to us later. Because then I don't have to be so careful about answering every question that he asks me now. And the interesting thing will be, not only the wrong answer that pops in first in my mind, but also maybe a slightly correction thing. But one of the stories of my life, as you'll probably find out, is I try to get things correct, and I probably obsess about not making too many mistakes. Okay, now your question, Ed, was how did I get into this, into the computing business? And of course, I was when the computers were first built in the 40s, I was 10 years old, so I certainly was not a pioneer in that sense. I saw my first computer in 1957, which is pretty late in the history game as far as computers are concerned. On the other hand, programming was still pretty much a new thing. There weren't that, I don't know, maybe 2,000 programmers in the world at that time. I'm not sure how to figure it, but it was still fairly early from that point of view. But I was a freshman in college, and so your question was, how did I get to be a physics student there in college? I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I guess I might as well, those of you who don't want to do the math could figure out I was born in 1938. My father was the first person in his, among all his ancestors who had gone to college. My mother was the first person in all of her ancestors who had gone to a year of school to learn how to be a typist. There was no tradition in our family of higher education at all. I think typical of America at the time. My grandfather, my great-grandfather was a blacksmith. My grandfather was a janitor, let's say, and the people were pretty smart. They could play cards well, but they didn't have an academic background. I don't want to dwell on this too much because I find that there's lots of discussion on the internet about the early part of my life because I gave an interview. There's a book called Mathematical People in which people ask me these questions at length as how I got started. The thing the one thing that stands out most probably is when I was an 8th grader, there was a contest run by a local TV station, a company called Ziegler's Giant Bar, and they said, how many words can you make out of the letters in Ziegler's Giant Bar? Well, there's a lot of letters there, and I was kind of intrigued by this question. So I had just seen an unabridged dictionary, and so I spent 2 weeks going through the unabridged dictionary, finding every word in that dictionary that could be made out of the letters of Ziegler's Giant Bar. And I pretended that I had a stomach ache, so I stayed home from school those 2 weeks. And the bottom line is that I found 4,500 words that could be made, and the judges had only found 2,500. And so I won the contest, and I won Ziegler's Giant Bars for everybody in my class, and also got to be on television and everything. So this was the first indication that I would obsess about problems that would take a while to that would take a little bit of long attention span to solve. Then Then, but my main interest in those days was music, and I almost became a music major when I went to college. Our high school was not very strong in science, but I had a wonderful chemistry and physics teacher who inspired me, and I guess that but when I got the chance to go to Case, looking back, it seems that the thing that really turned it was that Case was a challenge. It was supposed to be supposed to have a lot of meat and a lot of it wasn't going to be easy. While at the college where I had been admitted to be a music major, the people, when I visited there, they sort of emphasized how easy it was going to be there. And so instead of coasting, I think I was intrigued by the idea that that Case was going to make me work hard, and I was scared that I was going to flunk out, but still I was ready to work, and so I worked especially hard as a freshman, and then I coasted pretty much after that. But in my freshman year, I started out, and I found out that my chemistry teacher knew a lot of chemistry, but he didn't know physics or mathematics. My physics teacher knew physics and chemistry, but he didn't know much about mathematics. But my math teacher knew all three things. I was very impressed by my math teacher. Then in my sophomore year in physics, I had to take a required class of welding, and I just couldn't do welding. So I decided maybe I can't be a physicist. I mean, welding was so scary. I've got these thousands of volts in this stuff that I'm carrying, and I have to wear goggles. I can't have my glasses on. I can't see what I'm doing, and I'm too tall. The table is way down there. I'm supposed to be having these scary electrons shooting all over the place, and still connect X to Y. It was terrible. So I miserable failure at welding, and on the other hand, mathematics. In the sophomore year for mathematicians, they give you courses that are what we now call discrete mathematics, where you study logic and things that are integers instead of continuous quantities, and I was drawn to that. That was something somehow that had great appeal to me. Meanwhile, I had also been, in order to support myself, I had to work for the statisticians at Case, and first this meant drawing graphs and sorting cards. And so we had a fascinating machine where you put in the punch cards, and they fall into different piles, and you can look at what comes out, and then I could plot the numbers on a graph and get some, get some salary from this. And later on in my freshman year, there arrived a machine that at first I could only see through the glass window, and they called it a computer, and I think it was actually called the IBM 650 Univac. Actually, it was a funny name because Univac was a competing brand. And one night, a guy showed me how it worked, and gave me a chance to look at the manual, and it was love at first sight. I could sit all night with that machine and play with it, and so I wrote my first programs for that machine in I think it was well, let me see. Actually, to be exact, the first programs I wrote for the machine were not in machine language, but in a system called the Bell Interpretive System, which was like it was something like this. You have an instruction that would and the instruction would say add the number in cell 2 to the number in cell 15 and put the result in cell 30. And we had instructions like that. Bunch of them, this would, this was a simple way to learn programming. In fact, I still believe that it might be the best way to teach people programming instead of teaching them what we call a high-level language now. Right now, certainly it's something that you can easily teach to a 4th or 5th grader who hasn't had algebra yet, and get the idea of what a machine is. I was pledging a fraternity, and one of my fraternity brothers didn't want to do his homework assignment where he was supposed to find the roots of a 5th-degree equation. And so I looked at some textbooks, and it told me how to solve a 5th-degree equation. I programmed it in this Bell Interpretive language, and I wrote the program. And my memory is that it worked correctly the first time. I don't know if I really gave the right answers, but miraculously it ground out these numbers, and my fraternity brother passed his course, and I got into the fraternity, and that was my first little program. Then I learned about the machine language inside the 650, and I wrote my first program for the 650 probably in the spring of my freshman year, and debugged it at night. And I believe that when I first wrote the first time I wrote the program, it was about 60 instructions long in machine language. It was programmed to find the prime factors of a number. The 650 was a machine that had decimal arithmetic, worked with 10-digit numbers, and you could dial the numbers on the console of the machine. So you would dial a 10-digit number, and my program would go into action, and it would punch out cards that would say what are the factors of this number that you dialed in there. Computer was a very slow computer. In order to do a division instruction, it took 5 milliseconds. Right now, I don't know, is that 6 orders of magnitude slower than today's machines to do division. And of course, the way I did factoring was by division. I had to see if a number was divisible by 13, I had to divide by 13, and then I had to divide by 7. Well, I divided by 15 as well, 17, 19, and it would try to find everything that divided. And if I started out with a big 10-digit number that happened to be prime, have no divisors at all, I think it would take 15 or 20 minutes for my program to decide. And not only did my program have about 60 or so instructions when I started, they were almost all wrong. And when I finished, it was about 120, 130 instructions. So I had made more errors in this program than there were lines of code. One of the things that I had to change, for example, that took a lot of work was I had originally thought I could get all the prime factors onto one card, but a card had 80 columns, and you could get 10 digits. Each number took 10 digits, so I could only get 8 factors on a single card. Well, you take a number like 2 to the 32nd power, that's going to take 4 cards because there's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. So I had to put in lots of extra stuff in my program that would handle these cases besides making that. So my first program was very. It taught me a lot about the about the errors that I was going to be making in the future, and also about how to find errors. And that's sort of the story of my life, is making errors and trying to recover from them. Did I answer your question yet, or should I?
No.
No, I didn't think so.
Yeah. Don, a couple questions about your early career before CASE and at CASE. You mentioned it's very interesting that you mentioned the Ziegler's Giant Bar, because it points to a really early interest in combinatorics. And your intuition at combinatorics is one of the things that impresses so many of us. Why combinatorics, and how did you get to that? And what do you see combinatorics in your head in a different way than the rest of us do?
Well, I think that there is something wrong with my head, something strange about my head. It's clear that I have much better intuition about discrete things than continuous things. In physics, for example, I could pass the exams, and I could do the problems in quantum mechanics, but I couldn't intuit what I was doing. I didn't feel right being able to get an A on an exam, but without ever having the idea of how I would have thought of the questions that the person made up solving the exam. But on the other hand, in my discrete math class, these were things that really seemed part of me. So there's definitely something in how I had developed by the time I was a teenager that made me understand discrete objects, things that are like zeros and ones, of course, or things that are made out of alphabetic letters. Much better than things that like Fourier transforms or waves, radio wave and things like this. It's something, I can do these other things, but it's like a dog standing on his hind legs. Look, the dog can walk, but no, he's not walking. He's just the dog trying to walk. And that's the way it is for me, and a lot of the continuous or more geometrical things. But when it comes to marks on paper or integer numbers, like finding the prime factors of something, that's a question that appealed to me more than finding the roots of a polynomial. Now, how did this?
So, Don, question about that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interject this question, behaving like a cognitive psychologist, but
this is what you're paid to do, right?
Right. Herb Simon, Professor Simon of Carnegie Mellon University, once did a set of experiments that kind of separated thinkers into what he called visualizers and symbolizers. Mm-hmm. When you do the combinatorics and discrete math that you do, which so amazes us guys who can't do it that well, are you actually visualizing what's going on, or is it just pure symbol manipulation?
Well, I'm visualizing the symbols. To me, the symbols are reality. In a way, I take a mathematical problem, I translate it into formulas, and then the formulas are the reality. And I know how to transform one formula into another. And that's, in fact, that should be the subtitle of my book, Concrete Mathematics, is how to manipulate formulas. I'd like to talk about that a little, because it doesn't, it started out, my cousin Earl, who died Earl Goldenschwager, he was an engineer, eventually went to Southern California, but I knew him in Cleveland area. And when I was in second grade, he was, I think he was, he went to CASE, and he was one of the people who sort of influenced me that maybe good to go to CASE. And he told me when I was visiting him in the summer, he told me a little bit about algebra. You know, he said if you have two numbers and you know that the sum of these numbers is 100 and the difference of these numbers is 20, what are the two numbers? And he said, you know how you can solve this, Don? You can say x is one of the numbers and y is one of the numbers. You know, x plus y is 100 and x minus y is 20. And how do you find those numbers? He says, well, you add these two equations together and you get 2x equals 120, and you subtract the equations from each other and you get 2y equals 80. You know, oh, so x must be 100 and y must be 40. I mean, x must be 60 and y must be 40. Okay, wow. And this was an aha thing for me when I was in second grade. And so I liked symbols in this form. The main thing that I did, that I enjoyed doing in seventh grade, was diagramming sentences. And NPR there was a woman published a book about diagramming sentences, the lost art of diagramming sentences during the last year. But this is where you take a sentence of English and you find its structure, and it says, you know, it's a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase, and a noun phrase. So let's take a sentence here. How did you get to be a physics student? Okay. So here it's not a noun phrase followed by, it's an imperative, an imperative sentence. So it starts with a verb, and how did you get? It's very, very interesting, the structure of that sentence. We had a textbook that showed how to diagram simple English sentences, and the kids in our class, we would then try to apply this to sentences that weren't in the book, sentences that we would see on in newspapers or in advertisements or so on. And especially, we looked at the hymns in the hymnal, and we couldn't figure out how to diagram those, and we spent hours and hours trying to figure this out. But we thought about structure of language and trying to make these discrete tree structures out of English sentences, and that in seventh grade. And a lot of my friends and I, this turned us on. And when we got to high school, we breezed through all our English classes because we knew more than the teachers did. That they had never studied this diagramming. So I had this kind of interest in symbols and diagramming early on. It's discrete things early on, and so when I got into logic as a sophomore, and saw that mathematics involved a lot of symbol manipulation, then that took me there, and then I get, I see punch cards and the holes in cards are nice and discrete, and the way a computer works is totally discrete. A computer has to stand on its hind legs trying to do continuous mathematics. Now, I have a feeling that a lot of the brightest students don't go into mathematics because they a curious thing that they don't need algebra at the level I did. I don't think I was smarter than the other people in my class, but I learned algebra first, and so a lot of very bright students today don't see any need for algebra because they can they see a problem and say, oh, the sum of two numbers is 100 and the difference is 20. They just sort of say, oh, 60 and 40. They're so smart, they don't need algebra. And so they go on seeing lots of problems, and they can just do them without knowing how they do it. particularly, and then finally they get to a harder problem where the only way to solve it is with algebra. But by that time, they haven't learned the fundamental ideas of algebra, and so the fact that they were so smart prevented them from learning this important crutch that I think turned out to be important for the way I approach problems. And so then they say, oh, I can't do math, and they do very well as biologists and doctors and whatever and lawyers.
Don, when you're recounting your interest in the structure of languages very early, 7th grade, I think you said, that's really interesting because among the people, well, the word computer science wasn't used, but we would now call it information technology people. Your early reputation was in programming languages and compilers. Was the seeds of that planted at Case? And tell us about that early work.
Right.
I mean, that's how I got to know you first.
Right. The seeds. Yeah. So the seeds were planted at Case in the following way. I told you that okay. So first I learned about the 650, and then I'm not sure when it was, but it probably was in the summer of my freshman year, where we got a program from Carnegie, where you were a student, that was written by Alan Perlis and 3 other people.
IT.
The IT program, IT. Yeah. In standing for Internal Translator.
Yeah, it was Perlis, Van Zoren, and Joe Smith.
Yes, and this program, you would punch on cards a algebraic formula. You would say A equals B plus C. Well, you couldn't, in it you had to say x1 equals x2 plus x4, but because you didn't have a plus sign, you had to say A for the plus sign. So you had to say x1z, x2a, x4, and that would mean, or S, I guess, was plus, and A was for absolute value. But anyway, we had to encode algebra in terms of small character sets, a few letters, and there weren't that many characters you could punch on a card. But anyway, you punch this thing on a card, and you feed the card into the machine. The lights spin around for a few seconds, and then punch. Out come machine language instructions that set x1 equal to x2 plus x4. Automatic programming coming out of an algebraic formula. Well, this blew my mind. I couldn't understand how this was possible. To do this miracle, where I had just these punches on the card, and then to I could understand how to write a program that would factor numbers, but I couldn't understand how to write a program that would convert algebra into machine instructions.
So it hadn't yet occurred to you that the computer was a general symbol manipulating device?
No, that occurred to Lady Lovelace, but it didn't occur to me. I'm slow to pick up on these things, but then I persevere. So I got a hold of the source code for IT, which it was it couldn't be too long because the 650 had only 2,000 words of memory, and some of those words of memory had to be used to hold the data, as well as the instructions. So it was probably, I don't know, 1,000 lines of code. But the source code is not hard to find. They published it in a report, and I've seen it in several libraries. I'm pretty sure it's on the internet long ago, and I went through every line of that program, and during the summer we have a family get together on a beach on Lake Erie, and I would spend the time. Playing cards and playing tennis, but most of the time I was going through this listing, trying to find out the miracle of how the IT worked, and so okay, it wasn't impossible after all, and in fact, I thought of better ways to do it than were in that program. Since we're in a history museum, we should also mention that the program had originally been developed when Perlis was at Purdue, before he went to Carnegie, with 3 other people there. I think maybe Smith and Van Zoren came with Alan to Carnegie,
yes,
but there was
right.
a Sylvia Orgel and several other people at Purdue who had worked on a similar project for a different computer at Purdue, and that project Purdue got to get, Purdue also produced another compiler, a different one. It's not as well known as the IT, but anyway, I didn't know this at the time either. Still, the code was once I saw how it happened, this was inspiring to me, because also the discipline of reading other people's program was something good to learn early. And I through my life I've had a love of reading source materials, reading somebody's something that pioneers have written, and trying to understand this, what their thought processes were in order to write this out, because I find that this, especially when they're solving a problem I don't know how to solve, because this is the best way for me to put into my own brain how to get past stumbling blocks. So at Case I also remember looking at papers that Fermat had written in Latin in the 17th century in order to understand how that great number theorist approached problems. And so I continue. I have to rely on friends to help me get through Sanskrit manuscripts and things now. But I still, just last month I found, to my great surprise, that a concept of that I found to my great surprise that the concept of orthogonal Latin squares, which we probably talk about briefly later on, originated in North Africa in the 13th century, or was it 14th century? Anyway, it was. I was looking at some historical documents, and I came across this old Arabic accounts of this Arabic thing, and then by reading it in French translation, I was able to see that the guy really had this concept of orthogonal Latin squares that early, which the previous earliest known example was 1724. I love to look at the work of pioneers and see what they're and try to get into their minds and see what's happening. Yeah.
One of the things worth observing, it's off the track, but as long as we're talking about history, is that our current generation and generations of students don't even know the history of their own field, and they're constantly reinventing things or thoughtlessly disregarding things. We're not just talking about history going back in time hundreds of years. We're talking about history going back a dozen years or 24 years.
Yeah, I know. It was. It's such a common failing, and I would say that's my major disappointment with my teaching career. I was not able to get this across to any of my students, this love for that kind of scholarship and reading source materials. So a complete failure at passing this on to the people that I worked with the most closely. I don't know what I should have done, but let's hope that this, when I came to Stanford, I was from Caltech. I had been researching Pascal, and I couldn't find much about Pascal's work in the Caltech library. At Stanford, I found 2 shelves devoted to it, and I was really impressed by that. Then I came to Stanford Engineering Library. Stanford Engineering Library, everything was in storage if it was more than 5 years old. It was just it was a basket case at that time in the 60s. All right. Well, I've got to restrain myself from not telling too much about the early compiler. But anyway, I after IT, I have to mention that that I had a job by this time at the Case Computing Center. I wasn't just drawing graphs for statisticians anymore, and Case was one of the very few institutions in the country with a really enlightened attitude that undergraduate students were allowed to touch the computers by themselves and also write software for the whole campus. Dartmouth was another place, but there was a guy named Fred Way who set the policy at Case, and instead of going the way most places go, which would hire professionals to run their computer center, Case hired its own students to play with the machines and to do the stuff everybody was doing. And so there were about a dozen of us there, and we turned out to be fairly good contributors to the computing industry in the long range of things. So I told all of my friends how this IT compiler worked, and we got together and made our own greatly improved version. The following year, it was called Runcible. Every program in those days had to have an acronym, and this was the Revised Unified New Compiler, IT Basic Language Extended, or something like this. We found a reason for the name, but we added a million bells and whistles to IT, basically, and
all on the 2,000-word drum.
All on the 2,000-word drum. Not only that, but we had 4 versions of our compiler. One of them would compile to assembly language. One would compile directly into machine language. One version would use floating point hardware, and one version would use floating point attachment. And there were, if you changed 613 instructions, it would go from the floating point attachment to the floating point hardware version. And if you changed another 372 instructions, it would change from the assembly language version to the machine language version. And if we could figure out a way to save a line of code in the 373 instructions of one version, then we'd have to figure out a way to correspondingly save another line of code in the other version. Then we could have another instruction available to put in a new feature. And so Runcible went through this the stages of software development that have since become familiar, where there's what they call creeping featureism, where every user you see wants a new thing to be added to the software, and then you put that in, and pretty soon the thing gets have a harder and harder user manual. But that's the way software always has been, and we got our experience of this, and it was a group of us developing this. About I don't know, 8 of us worked together on different parts of it, but my friend Bill Lynch and I did most of the parts that were the compiler itself. Other people were working on the subroutines that would support the library and things like that. Since I mentioned Bill Lynch, I also, I guess, so I wrote a paper about the way Runcible worked inside, and it was published in the Communication of the ACM during my senior year. Because we had seen other articles in this journal that describe methods that weren't as good as the ones that were in our compiler. So we thought, okay, let's put the word. But I had no idea what scientific publishing was all about. I had only experienced magazines before, and magazines don't give credit for things; they just tell the news. And so I wrote this article, and it explained, you know, how we did it in our compiler. But I didn't mention Bill Lynch's name or anything in the article. And I found out, to my great surprise afterwards, that I was getting credit for having invented these things when actually it was a completely team effort, and mostly other people. In fact, and I had just, you know, caught a few bugs and made, you know, done a lot of things, but nothing really very original. So this was, you know, I had to learn about scholarship. I mean, how about scientific publishing and things as part of this story. Now, so we got this experience with users, and I also wrote the user manual for this machine. I'm an undergraduate. Case allows me to write the user manual for Runcible, and it's used as textbook in classes. So here I've got a class that I'm taking. You know, I can take a class, and I wrote the textbook for it already when I'm in high school, as an undergraduate. So anyway, this meant that I had an unusual visibility on campus, I guess, and what actually. The truth is that Case was a really great college for undergraduates, and it had superb teachers, but it did not have very strong standards for graduate studies. It was very difficult to get admitted to undergraduate program at Case, and a lot of people would flunk out. But in graduate school, it wasn't that hard to get over. And I noticed this, and I started taking graduate courses because there was no competition, and so this impressed my teachers that, oh, Knuth is taking graduate courses, you know, not realizing that this was the line of least resistance, so that I could do other things like write compilers as I'm a student, and I worked on I edited a magazine and things like that, and played in the band and did lots of activity. Now, the story is, however, what about compilers? Well, I got a job at the end of my senior year to write a compiler for Burroughs, who wanted to sell their drum machine to people who had IBM 650s. So Burroughs had this computer called the 205. Which was a drum machine that had 4,000 words of memory instead of 2,000, and they needed a compiler for it, and Algol was a new language at the time. Anyway, somebody heard that I knew something about how to write compiler, and Thompson Ramo Wooldridge had a consulting branch in Cleveland, and they approached me early on my senior year and said, Don, we want to make a proposal to Burroughs Corporation that we'll write them an Algol compiler, and would you write it for us if we got the contract? And so I believe what happened is that they made a proposal to Burroughs for $75,000. They would write an Algol compiler, and they would pay me $5,000 for it, something like this. And Burroughs turned it down. So then a couple of months, but meanwhile I had learned about the 205 machine language, and it was kind of appealing to me. So I made my own proposal to Burroughs, and I said, I'll write you an Algol compiler for $5,000. But I can't implement all of Algol for, no, I think, I can't, I told him I can't implement all of Algol for this, I'm just one guy. Let's leave out procedures, subroutines. Well, this is a big hole in the language. And Burroughs said, no, you got to put in procedures. And I said, okay, I'll put in procedures, but you got to pay me $5,500. And so that's what happened. So they paid me $5,500, which was a fairly good salary in those days. I think like a college professor was making $8,000 or $9,000 a year in those days. So I did between graduating from Case and going to Caltech, I worked on this compiler. And as I drove out to California, I drove 100 miles a day, and I sat in a motel and wrote code. And the coding forum in which I wrote this code, I've now donated to the Computer History Museum, and you can see exactly the code that I wrote and so on. And I debugged it, and it was Christmas time. I had the compiler ready for Burroughs to use. So I was interested in had some two compilers that I knew all the code by the end of the '60s, and then I learned about other projects. When I was in graduate school, some people came to me and said, "Don, how about writing software full-time, quit graduate school, we'll just name your price, we'll write compilers for a living, and you'll have a pretty good living." And so I was my second year of graduate school, and they
in what department at Caltech?
I was at Caltech in math department. There was no such thing as a computer science department anywhere.
But you didn't do physics in.
I didn't do physics. Yes, I switched into math. After my sophomore year at Case, after flunking welding. I switched into math, and there were only 7 of us math majors at Case. And I went to Caltech. That's another story we'll get into soon. But at Caltech, I'm in my second year at Caltech, and I was a consultant to Burroughs. After finishing my compiler for Burroughs, I joined their product planning department, and the product planning department was people who were largely composed of people who had written the best software ever done in the world up to that time, which was a Burroughs algol compiler for the 220 computer. That was a great leap forward for software. It was the first software that used list processing and high-level data structures in an intelligent way. So they took the ideas of Newell and Simon and applied them to compilers, and it ran circles around all the other things that we were doing. So I wanted to get to know these people, and then they were by this time in the product planning group, because Burroughs was doing its very innovative machines that are the opposite of RISC. They tried to put they tried to make the machine language look like algebraic language. And so this group I joined at Burroughs as a consultant, and I kept my so I had a programming hat when I was outside of Caltech, and at Caltech I'm a mathematician taking my grad studies, and so a startup company called Green Tree Corporation, because it was green is the color of money, came to me and said, "Don, name your price, write compilers for us, and we will take care of finding computers for you to debug them on, and assistants for you to do your work, and name your price." And so I said, "Oh, okay, $100,000," assuming that this was, I mean, in that era, this was not quite in Bill Gates's level today, but it was sort of out there. And the guy didn't blink, and he said, "Okay," And so then I didn't really blink either, and I said, "Well, I'm not going to do it. I just thought this was an impossible number." So, but at that point, I made the decision in my life that I wasn't going to optimize my income, but I was really going to, do what I thought I could do for. Well, I don't know. If you ask me what what makes me most happy, number one would be somebody said, I learned something from you, and number two would be somebody saying, I used your software. But number infinity would be, number infinity minus one would be, I bought your book, not as good as I read your book, and then there's, I bought your software, that was not in my own personal priorities. So that decision came up in the sophomore. Well, then I kept up with the literature about compilers, and I because the communication to the ACM was where the action was, and I also worked with people on trying to debug the Algol language, which had problems with it, and so I published a few papers about like the remaining trouble spots in Algol 60 was one of the papers that I worked on, and I chaired a committee called SmallGol, which was to find a subset of Algol that would work on small computers. And so I was active in the programming.
Was McCarthy on SmallGol?
No, I don't think he was.
Or Clausworth?
No, a lot of people were. Well, there was a big European group, but this was mostly Americans, and they were gosh, I can't remember, but we had about 20 people, co-authors of the paper. But it was SmallGol 61. I don't know. So it was so long ago I can't remember. But all the authors are there. But there were.
You were still a graduate student.
I was a graduate student, yeah. But this was my computing life.
Yeah. What did your thesis advisor think of all this?
Oh, at Case, they thought it was terrible that I even touched computers. The math professors said, don't dirty your hands with that. It's just,
you mean Caltech?
No, first at Case. But at Caltech was one of the few graduate schools that did not have that opinion that I shouldn't touch computers. I went to Caltech because they had this strong in combinatorics. And their computing system was incredibly arcane, and it was terrible. I couldn't run any programs at Caltech. The only, I would have to use punched paper tape in order to. They didn't even have punch cards, and their computing system was horrible unless you went to JPL, which was quite a bit Jet Propulsion Laboratory off campus. And there you would have to submit a job and then come back a day later, and you couldn't touch the machines or anything. It was just hopeless. At Burroughs, I could go into what they called the fishbowl, which was the demonstration computer room, and I could run there hands-on every night and get work done. There was a program that I had debugged in one night at Burroughs. That was solving a problem that Marshall Hall, my thesis advisor, was interested in, but then it took more memory than the Burroughs machine had, so I had to run it at JPL. Well, 8 months later, I had gotten the output from JPL, and I had also accumulated listings that were 10 feet high in my office, because it's a 1 or 2 day turnaround time, and then they give you a memory dump at the end of the run, and then you can say, oh, then I'll change this and I'll try another thing tomorrow. And so, it was incredibly inefficient and brain damaged computing at Caltech in the early 60s. But I kept track with the programming languages community, and I became editor of the programming languages section of the Communication of the ACM and the Journal of the ACM in, I don't know, 64, 65, something like that. And so I was not a graduate student, but I was just out of graduate school in the 60s. That was definitely the part of computing that I did by far the most in those days, and computing was divided into three categories. So by the time I came to Stanford, you were either a numerical analyst or artificial intelligence or programming language person. and we had three qualifying exams, and there was a tripartite division of the field.
Don, just before we leave your thesis advisor, your thesis itself was in mathematics, not in computing, right?
Of course, yes.
Tell us a little bit about that and what your thesis advisor's influence on your work was at the time.
Because this is combinatorial, and it's definitely an important part of the story. So discrete combinatorics was not a academic subject at Case, and Caltech was one of the few places that had it as a graduate course, and there were textbooks that began to be written. I believe at Stanford, for example, George Danzig introduced the first class in combinatorics probably about 1970, and it was something that was low on the totem pole in the mathematics world in those days. The high on the totem pole was the Bourbaki school from France of highly abstract mathematics that was involved with higher orders of infinities and things too. But that, in other words, I had colleagues at Caltech, and I would say you and I intersect at countable infinity, because I never think of anything that's more than countable infinity. You never think of anything that's less than countable infinity. But I'm mostly stuck to things that were finite in my own work. But at Case, when I'm a senior, we had a visiting professor, R.C. Bose from North Carolina, who was a very inspiring lecturer. He was an extremely charismatic guy, and he had just solved a problem that became front page news on the New York Times, and it was to find it's called orthogonal Latin squares. Now today there's a craze called Sudoku, but I imagine by the time people are watching this tape or listening to this tape, that craze will have faded away. But a Latin square is an arrangement of, let's say an n by n Latin square is an arrangement of n letters. So every row and every column has all n of the letters. And orthogonal Latin squares, where you have two Latin squares with the property that if you put them next to each other, so you have a symbol from the first and a symbol from the second, the n squared cells you get have all n squared possibilities, all combinations of, A will occur with A somewhere, A will occur with B somewhere, and Z will occur with Z somewhere. So these are now a famous paper from 1783, I think, anyway, by Leonard Euler had conjectured that it was impossible to find orthogonal Latin squares that were 10 by 10 or 14 by 14 or 18 by 18 and well, 6 by 6, all the cases that were twice an odd number. And this conjecture was believed for 170 years, and even had been proved 3 times, but the people found holes in the proof. So in 1959, R.C. Bose and 2 other people found that it was wrong, and they constructed Latin squares that were 10 by 10 and 14 by 14. They showed that all those cases were actually, it was possible to find orthogonal Latin squares. So I met Bose at I was taking a class from him, and because it was a graduate class, and I was taking graduate classes, and he asked me if I could find some 12 by 12 orthogonal Latin squares, and it sounded like an interesting program, so I wrote it up, and I presented him with the answer the next morning, and he was happy and impressed, and we found 5 mutually orthogonal Latin squares of order 12, and that was, that became a paper. Some interesting stories about that I won't go into. The main thing is he was he was on the cutting edge of this research, and I was at an undergraduate place where we had great teaching, but we didn't have cutting edge researchers. So he could recommend me to graduate school, and he could also tell me, Marshall Hall is very good at combinatorics, so he gives me a good plug for going to Caltech. I had visited California with my parents on summer vacations, so when I applied to graduate school, I applied to Stanford, Berkeley, and Caltech, and no other places. And when I got admitted to Caltech, I got admitted to all three. But I took Caltech because I knew that they had good combinatorial attitude there, which was not really true at Stanford. In fact, Stanford, I wouldn't have been able to study Latin squares at all. While we're at it, I might as well mention that I got fellowships. I got National Science Foundation Fellowship, Woodrow Wilson Foundation Fellowship to come to these places, but they all had the requirement that you could not do anything except study as a graduate student. I couldn't be a consultant to Burroughs and also have an NSF fellowship. So I turned down the fellowships. So Marshall Hall was then my thesis advisor, and he was a world-class mathematician and had done for a long time pioneering work in combinatorics. So he was he was my mentor, and but it was a funny thing because I was such in awe of him that when I was in the same room with him, I could not think straight. I wouldn't remember my name. I would write down what he was saying, and then I'd go back to my office so that I could figure it out. It was we couldn't do joint research together in the same room. We could do it back and forth. It was almost like farming my programs out to JPL to be run. But we did collaborate on a few things, and the one thing that we did the most on actually never got published, however, because it turned out that it just didn't lead to the. I mean, he thought he had a way to solve Burnside problem in group theory, but it didn't pan out. And so after we did all the computation, I learned a lot in the process, but none of these programs have ever appeared in print or anything. I just it taught me how to deal with tree structures inside a machine, and I used the techniques in other things over the years. So that was. He also was an extremely good advisor that he would, in better ways than I was with my students, that he would seem to keep track of me to make sure I wasn't slipping. When I was working with my own graduate students, I was pretty much in a mode where they would bug me, and instead of me bugging them. And he would actually write me notes and say, Don, why don't you do such and such? Now my thesis was I chose a thesis topic which was to find certain kind of what they call block designs. I'll just say symmetric block designs with parameter lambda equals 2, and anybody can look that up and find out what that means. I don't want to explain it now. But at the time I did this, there were, I believe there were 6 known designs of this form altogether. And I had found a new way to look at those designs, and so I thought maybe I'll be able to find infinitely many more such designs, and they would be mostly academic interest, although statisticians would justify that they could use them somehow, but mostly just for the do they exist or not? This was the question, purely intellectual curiosity, and so that was going to be my thesis topic. To see if I could find lots of these elusive combinatorial patterns. But one morning, I received I was looking at another problem entirely, having to do with finite projective geometry, And I got a listing from a guy at Princeton who had just computed 32 solutions to a problem that I had been looking at with respect to the homework problem in my class, in my combinatorics class. And he had found that there are 32 solutions of type A and 32 solutions of type B to this particular problem. And I said, that's interesting, because of the 32 solutions of type A, one of those was a well-known was a well-known construction. The 32 of type B, nobody had ever found any type B solutions before for the next case, for the next higher up case. And so I said so I remember I had just gotten this listing from Princeton, and I was riding up on the elevator with Olga Todd, one of our professors, and I said, Mrs. Todd, I think I'm going to have a theorem in an hour. I'm going to look at these two lists of 32 numbers. I'm going to find, for every one on this page, I'm going to find a corresponding one on this page. I'm going to psych out the rule that explains why there happen to be 32 of each kind. And sure enough, an hour later, I had seen how to get from each solution on the first page to the solution on the second page. I showed this to Marshall Hall. He said, "Oh, Don, that's your thesis. Don't worry on this lambda equal 2 business. Write this up and get out of here." Mm-hmm. And so that became my thesis. And it's a good thing, because since then only one more design with lambda equals 2 has been discovered in the history of the world. So I might still be working on my thesis if I had stuck to that problem. Well, I felt a little guilty that I had solved my PhD problem in 1 hour, and so I dressed it up with a few other chapters of stuff. But the whole thesis is 70-some pages long, and I discovered that it's now on the internet. I just probably for people's curiosity, I suppose. What did he write about in those days? But of all the areas of mathematics that I've applied to computer science, I would say the only area that I've never applied to computer science is the one that I did my thesis in. It just was good training for me to exercise my brain cells.
Yeah, that's in fact for your colleagues, that's kind of a black hole in their knowledge of you and understanding of you. Is that that thesis?
The thesis, yeah. Well,
but
yeah, that's fine.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the reason that it's not used anymore is because these designs turn out that, okay, we can construct them with all this pain and careful, deep analysis, but it turned out later on that if we just work at random, we get even better results. So it was kind of pointless from a point of view of applications, except for certain codes and things like that.
Don, just a footnote to that story. I intended this would come up later in the interview, but it's just so great a point to bring it in. When I've been advising graduate students, I tell them that the really hard part of the thesis is finding the right problem. That's at least half the problem, and then the other half is just doing it, and that's the easy part of it. So I'm not impressed by this 1 hour. I mean, the hard part went into finding the problem, not in the solving of it. And it seemed to me that we'll get to, of course, the great piece of work that you did on the art of computer programming. But it's always seemed to me that the researching and then writing the text of the art of computer programming was a problem generator for you. The way you and I have expressed it in the past is that you were weaving a fabric and you would encounter holes in the fabric, and those would be the great problems to solve. And that's more than half the work of, once you find the problems, you can go get at them. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, we'll probably comment on it more in later too. But I guess one of the the blessings and curses of the way I work is that I don't have difficulty thinking of questions, things that I don't have too much difficulty in the problem generation phase, what to work on. I have to actively suppress stimulation so that I'm not working on too many things at once. But you can ask questions that are. The hard thing is not to, for me anyway, is not to find a problem, but to find a good problem, to find a problem that has some juice to it, something that will not just be isolated. It's just something that happens to be true. But also will be something that will have spin-offs. That there will be, once you've solved the problem, the techniques are going to apply to many other things, or that this will be a link in a chain to other things. It's not just having a question that needs an answer, and it's very easy to. There's a professor. I might as well mention his name, although I don't like to. It would be hard to mention the concept without somebody thinking of his name. But his name is Smarandash. I've never met him, but he generates problems by the zillions, and I've never seen one of them that I thought had any merit in it whatsoever. I mean, you can generate sequences of numbers in various ways, and you can cube them and remove the middle digit or something like this, and they say, oh, is this prime? Something like that. So there's all kinds of ways of defining sequences of numbers or patterns of things and saying and then asking a question about it. And those are but if one of my students say, I want to work on this for the thesis, I would have to say this problem stinks. So the hard thing is not to come up with a problem, but to come up with a fruitful problem. And like the famous problem of Fermat's last theorem, can there be a to the n plus b to the n equals c to the n for n greater than 2? It has no applications. So you found A, B, and C. It doesn't really matter to anything. But in the course of working on this problem, people discovered beautiful things about mathematical structures that have solved, uncountably many practical applications as a spin-off. So that's one, and my thesis problem that I solved was probably not in that sense, though, extremely interesting either. It answered a question whether there existed projective geometries of certain orders that weren't symmetrical, and all the cases that people had ever thought of were symmetrical, and I thought of unsymmetrical ways to do it. Well, so what? But the technique that I used for it was still led to some insight and got around some other blocks that people had in other theories. Though I have to worry about not getting bogged down in every question that I think of, because otherwise I can't move on and get anything out the door. Yeah.
So Don, around this time, we've gotten a little mixed up between the finishing of your thesis and your assistant professorship at Caltech, but it doesn't matter. Around this time, there was the embryonic beginnings of a multi-volume work which you're known for, The Art of Computer Programming. And could you tell us the story about the beginnings? Because soon it's going to be the middle of it. You were working on it so fast.
Yeah, this is of course, really the story of my life, because I hope to live long enough to finish it, but I may not, because it's turned out to be such a huge project. But I got married in the summer of 1961. After my first year of graduate school, my wife then she finished college, and I could use the money I had made on that, the $5,000 on that compiler to finance a trip to Europe for our honeymoon. And we had 4 months of wedded bliss in Southern California. And then a man from Addison Wesley came to visit me and said, "Don, we would like you to write a book about how to write compilers." The more I thought about it, I decided, oh yes, I've got this book inside of me. I sketched out that day. I still have the sheet of tablet paper on which I wrote. I sketched out 12 chapters that I thought ought to be in such a book. And I told Jill, my wife, I think I'm going to write a book. And as I say, we had 4 months of bliss, because after, the rest of our marriage has all been devoted to this book. Well, we still have happiness, but I mean, but really this is I wake up every morning and I still haven't finished the book, and so I try to I have to organize the rest of my life around this as one main unifying theme. The book was supposed to be about how to write a compiler, and they had heard about me from one of their editorial advisors that I knew something about how to do this. The idea appealed to me for 2 main reasons. One is that I did enjoy writing. I had in high school I had been editor of the weekly paper. In college, I was editor of the science magazine, and I worked on the campus paper, copy editor, and I was writing. I told you I wrote the manual for for that compiler that we wrote, and so I enjoyed I enjoyed writing, and so number one, I also Addison Wesley was the people who were asking me to do this book. My favorite textbooks had been published by Addison Wesley. They had done the books that I loved the most as a student, and for them to come to me and say, "Wow, would you write a book for us?" And here I am, just a second-year graduate student. This was a thrill. Another very important reason at the time was that I knew that there was a great need for a book about compilers, because there were a lot of people who were even in 1962. This was January 1962. Even in 1962, people were starting to rediscover the wheel. The knowledge was out there, but it hadn't been explained, and the people who had discovered it, though, were scattered all over the world, and they didn't know of each other's work either very much. I had been following, and everybody I could think of who could write a book about compilers, as far as I could see, they would only give a piece of the fabric. They would slant it to their own view of it, and so there might be 4 people who could write about it, but they would write 4 different books that would, and I could present all 4 of their viewpoints in what I would think was a balanced way, without any axe to grind, without any without slanting it towards something that I thought would be misleading to the compiler writers of the future. So I considered myself as a journalist, essentially. I mean, I could be an expositor, a tech writer that could do the job that was needed in order to take the work of these brilliant people and make it accessible to the audience, to the world. And so that was my motivation. Now, I didn't have much time to spend on it. Then I just had this page of paper with 12 chapter headings on it, and that's all I could do for. That's all I could do while I'm a consultant at Burroughs and doing my graduate work. I signed a contract, but they said, we know it'll take you a while, so I didn't really begin to have much time to work on it until 1963, my third year of graduate school, as I'm already finishing up on my thesis. And in the summer of '62, I guess I should mention, I wrote another compiler. This was for UNIVAC. It was a Fortran compiler, and I spent the summer. I sold my soul to the devil, I guess you say, for 3 months in the summer of 1962 to write a Fortran compiler, and I believe that this salary for that was $15,000, which was much more than a assistant professor. I think assistant professors were getting $8,000 or $9,000 in those days. Anyway, it was.
Well, when I started in 1960 at Berkeley, I was getting $7,600 for the 9-month year.
Yeah. Okay. So you see, so I got $15,000 for a summer job in 1962 writing a Fortran compiler, and one day during that summer, I was writing the part of the compiler that looks up identifiers in a hash table, and the method that we used is called linear probing, and basically you take the variable name that you want to look up, you scramble it into a like you square it or something like this, and then that gives you a number between 1 and well, in those days it would have been between 1 and 1,000, and then you look there, and if you find it, good. If you don't find it, go to the next place and keep on going until you either get to an empty place or you found the number you're looking for. It's called linear probing, and there was a rumor that one of Professor Feller's students at Princeton had tried to figure out how fast linear probing works, and was unable to succeed. So this was a new thing for me. It was a case where I was doing programming, but I also had a mathematical problem that would go into my other, my winter job was being a math student. My summer job was writing compilers. There was these worlds did not intersect at all in my life at that point. And so I spent one day during the summer while writing the compiler looking at the mathematics of how fast does linear probing work, and got lucky, and I solved the problem. I figured out some math, and I kept 2 or 3 sheets of paper with me, and I typed it up, and I guess that's on the internet now, because this became really the genesis of my main research work, which developed not to be working on compilers, but to be working on what we call analysis of algorithms, which is have a computer method and find out how good is it quantitatively. So I could say, if I got so many things to look up in the table, how long is linear probing going to take? And it dawned on me that that this was just one of many algorithms that would be important, and each one would lead to a fascinating mathematical problem. And so this was easily a good lifetime source of rich problems to work on. And okay, so here I am then in the middle of 1962 writing this Fortran compiler, and I had one day to do the research and the mathematics that changed my life for my future research trends. But now I've gotten off the topic. What your original question was?
So we were talking about sort of you talked about the embryo of
the art of computer.
But then the compiler book morphed into the art of computer programming, which became a 7-volume.
Exactly. Yeah.
plan.
So anyway, I'm working on a compiler and I'm thinking about this. Well, then but now I'm starting after I finished this summer job. Then I began to do things that were going to be relating to the book. And one of the things I knew I had to have in the book was a artificial machine. Because I'm writing a compiler book, but machines are changing faster than I can write books, so I have to have a machine that I'm totally in control of. And so I invented this machine called Mix, which was typical of the computers of 1962. And in 1963, I wrote a simulator for Mix so that I could write sample programs for it. And I taught a class at Caltech on how to write programs in assembly language for this hypothetical computer. Then I started writing the parts of that dealt with sorting problems and searching problems, like the linear probing idea. So I began to write those parts, which are part of a compiler of the book, and I had a bunch of I had several hundred pages of notes on gathering for those chapters of the art of computer programming, developing while I'm reading. That's before I graduated. I've already done quite a bit of writing on the art of computer programming, and I met George Forsyth about this time. George was the man who inspired both of us to come to Stanford during the 60s. And George came down to Southern California for a talk, and I met, and he said, "Oh, come up to Stanford, and how about joining our faculty?" And I said, "Oh no, I can't do that. I just got married, and I've got to finish this book first." And so I said, I think I'll finish the book next year, and then I can come up. And I start thinking about the rest of my life, but I get this book done before. I want to get my book done before my son is born. Well, John is now 40-some years old, and I'm not done with the book. But this is part of my lack of expertise is any good estimation procedure as to how long projects are going to take. I way underestimated how much needed to be written about in this book. Well, anyway, I started writing the manuscript, and I went merrily along, writing pages and of things that I thought were really needed to be said. And of course, it didn't take long before I had started to discover a few things of my own that weren't in any of the existing literature. So I did have an axe to grind. The message that I was presenting was in fact not going to be unbiased at all. It was going to be based on my own particular slant on stuff, and that original reason for why I should write the book became impossible to sustain. But it gave me this fact that I had worked on linear probing and solved the problem gave me a new unifying theme for the book. I was going to base it around this idea of analyzing algorithms and have some quantitative ideas about how good methods were, not just that they worked, but that they worked well, and this method worked 3 times better than this method, or 3.1 times better than this method, so I also at this time I was learning mathematical techniques that I had never been taught in school. I found they were out there, but they just hadn't been emphasized openly about how to solve problems of this kind. So my book would also present a different kind of mathematics than was common in the curriculum at the time, that was very relevant to analysis of algorithms. I went to the publishers, I went to Addison Wesley and said, how about changing the title of the book from Art of Computer Programming to The Analysis of Algorithms? And they said, that'll never sell. You know, their focus group couldn't buy that one. So I'm glad they stuck to the original title, although I'm also glad to see that several books have now come out called The Analysis of Algorithms 20 years down the line. But in those days, the art of computer programming is very important because I'm thinking of the aesthetical, the whole question of writing programs as something that has artistic aspects in all senses of the word art, including the one idea is art, which means artificial, and the other art means fine art. So all these are long stories, but I got to cover it fairly quickly. I've got the art of computer programming started out, and I'm working on my 12 chapters, and I finished a rough draft of all 12 chapters by, I think it was like 1965. I've got 3,000 pages of notes. About this, including in these notes, a very good example of what you mentioned about seeing holes in the fabric. So one of the most important chapters in the book is parsing, going from somebody's algebraic formula and figuring out the structure of the formula, just the way I had done in 7th grade, finding the structure of English sentences. I have to do this with mathematical sentences, and so I have chapter 10 is all about parsing of context-free languages, what we call it at the time, and I covered what people had published about context-free languages and parsing, and I got to the end of the chapter, and I said, well, you can combine these ideas and these ideas, and all of a sudden you get a unifying thing which goes all the way to the limit. These other ideas had sort of gone part way there. They would say, oh, if a grammar satisfies this condition, I can do it efficiently. If the grammar satisfies this condition, I can do it efficiently. But now, all of a sudden, I saw there was a way to say, I can find the most general condition that can be done efficiently without look ahead, without looking ahead to the end of the sentence. That you could make a decision on the fly, reading from left to right, about what the structure of the thing. And that was just a natural outgrowth of seeing the different pieces of the fabric that other people had put together and writing it into a chapter for the first time. But I felt that this general concept, I couldn't. Well, I didn't feel that I had surrounded the concept. I knew that I had it, and I could prove it, and I could check it, but I couldn't really intuit it all in my head. I didn't, I knew it was right, but I didn't. But it was too hard for me really to explain it to it well, so I didn't put it in the art of computer programming. I thought it was beyond the scope of my book. It was something that textbooks don't have to cover everything. When you get to the harder theorems, then you have to go to the literature. And my idea at that time, I'm writing this book, and I'm thinking it's going to be published very soon. So any little things I discover and put in the book, I didn't bother to write a paper and publish in a journal because I figure it'll be in my book very soon anyway. And in a computer science is changing so fast. My book is, my book is bound to be obsolete. It takes a year for it to go through editing and people drawing the illustrations, and then they have to print it and bind it and so on. So I have to be a little bit ahead of the state of the art if my book isn't going to be obsolete when it comes out. So I kept most of the stuff to myself that I had been, these little ideas I'd been coming up with. But when I got to this idea of left to right parsing, I said, well, here's something I don't really understand very well. So I'll publish this. Let other people figure out what it was, and then they can tell me what what I should have said. And so I published that paper, I believe, in 1965. At the end of finishing the chapter of my draft of the chapter, which didn't get as far as that story, LRK. Well, now textbooks of computer science start with LRK, and take off from there. But that's I want to give you an idea
Don, for historical reasons for the audience, tell the audience where the LRK paper was published, so they can go look it up.
Yeah, it was published in a journal called Information and Control, which is now changed its name to Information and Computation. But in those days, you can see why they called it Information and Control. And it was the journal that had the best papers on parsing of languages and at the time. And so, it's a long paper and difficult. But anyway, it's also reprinted in my book, Selected Papers on Computer Languages, which with a few corrections to the original. And in the original, I drew the trees with the root at the bottom, but everybody draws trees with the root at the top now. So the reprint has trees drawn in a more modern notation. So I'm trying to give the flavor of the way things were in 1965. My son was born in summer of '65. And I finished this work on LRFK at Christmas time in '65, and then I had I think one more chapter to write, but earlier in '66 I had all 3,000 pages of the manuscript ready, and so I typed. I typed chapter 1, and my idea was I looked at these pages. These pages are all handwritten, and it looked to me like my handwriting. I would guess that was how many words there were on a page, and I typed it up, and I found out that and I had chapter 1, and I typed it and I sent it to the publishers, and they said, Don, what have you written here? This book is going to be huge. I had actually written them a letter earlier as I'm working on sorting. I said to the guy who signed me up. I signed a contract with him, and by this time he had been promoted. No. I'm not sure about this, but anyway, I wrote to him in '63 or '64 saying, as I'm working on this book on compilers, there's a few other there's a few things that deserve a more complete treatment than a compiler writer needs to know. Do you mind if I add a little bit here? And they said, sure, Don, go right ahead. Whatever you think is good to write about, do it. So then I send them chapter 1 a few years later. By this time, I guess the guy's promoted, and he's saying, "Oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Did you realize that this book is going to be more than 2,000 pages long, or something like this?" And no, I didn't. I thought I had read a lot of books, and I thought I understood about things, and I had my type pages on there, and I was figuring 5 type pages would go into 1 page of text. It just looked it just looked to me, to my eyes, if I had 5 typewritten pages, that the letters in a textbook are smaller. But I should have realized that that the guys at the publishing house knew something about books too, and they told me no, it was 1.5 pages of text makes a book, and I didn't believe it. So I went back to my calculus book, which Addison Wesley book, and I typed it out, and sure enough, they were absolutely right. It took 1.5 pages. So I had a 3 times longer. No wonder it had taken me so long to write get chapter 1 done. So I'm sitting here with much more than I thought I had. Meanwhile, the computer science hasn't been standing still, and so I knew that there's more still has to be written as I go. So we have I went to Boston, and they, I know, I happened to catch a glance at some notes that my editor had written to himself for the meeting that we were going to have with his bosses, and one of the comments on there was "terrific cost bind" or something like that. And publishing houses all have their horror stories about a professor who writes 12 volumes about the history of an egg or something like this, and it never sells, and it's just a terrible thing that they have a contract that they've signed, and so they had to figure out how to rescue something out of this situation. Knuth coming with this monster book. Well, so we thought at first we would package it into three volumes instead of one, then they sent out the chapter 1 to a dozen readers, a focus group, and they got comments on it, and well, the readers liked it, what they saw in that chapter, and so at least I had some support from them, and so then after a few more months, we decided to package it as 7. They figured out of the 12 chapters, there were 7 of them that would sell, and we could stick the other 5 in some way that would make a fairly decent 7-volume set, and so that was what was finally announced in 1966 or something, that it would come out in 7 volumes. After typing chapter 1, I typed chapter 2, and so on. I kept working on it all the time. When I'm not teaching my classes at Caltech, I'm typing up my notes and polishing the handwritten notes that I had made from these 3,000 pages of rough draft. That sets the scene for the early days of the art of computer programming, right?
So what year are we at now?
So what happened is, I'm at Caltech. I'm a math professor. I'm teaching classes in. I'm teaching classes in algebra and once in a while combinatorics at Caltech, and also 1 or 2 classes connected with computing, like sorting. I think I might have taught one quarter, but most of the things I'm teaching at Caltech are orthogonal to the art of computer programming, and my daughter is born in December of '66. I've got the entire manuscript of Volume 1 to the publisher. I think during '66, and I'm working on typing up chapters 3 and 4 at the beginning of '67. I think this is approximately the way things stand. So I was trying to finish the book before my son was born in '65, and what happened is that I got, so I'm sitting now. The Volume 1 actually turned out to be almost 700 pages, which means 1,000 typewritten pages, you can see why I said that my blissful marriage wasn't quite so blissful because you know, I'm working on this a lot. I mean, I'm doing most of it actually watching the Late Late Show on television, and I have also some earplugs for when the kids are screaming a little bit too much. So here I am typing the art of computer programming when the babies are crying, although I did also change diapers and so on. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that what we need to do is talk about, this is December '66 when your daughter was born, and that leads sort of directly into this magical year of 1967, which didn't end so magically. So let's continue on with 1967 in a moment.
Okay.
So Don, once you told me that 1967 was your most creative year, and I'd like to get into it. And you also said you had only a very short time to do your research during that year, and the year didn't end so well for you. So let's talk about that.
Well, it's certainly a pivotal year in my life, but you can see in retrospect why things were building up to a crisis, because I was just working at high pitch all the time. I mean, I think I mentioned I was editor of ACM Communications and ACM Journal in the programming languages sections, and I took the editorial duties very seriously. I had, a lot of people were submitting papers, and I would write long referee reports in many cases, as well as discussing with referees the things that had to be done. I was a consultant to Burroughs on innovative machines. I was consumed with getting the art of computer programming done, and I had children, and being a father and husband, so I would start out every day and I would say, well, what am I going to accomplish today? And then I would stay up until I finished it. And I used to be able to do this. When I was in high school and I was editor of the paper, I would do an all-nighter every week when the paper came out, and I would just go without sleep on those occasions. And so I was sort of used to working in this mode where I didn't realize I was punishing my body. I could, I mean, we didn't have iPods and things like that, but I did. But still, I had the TV on. That was enough to kill the boredom of I had to do the typing of a lot of material. Now, in 1967 is when things came to a head. Also, it was time for me to make a career decision. As I was getting offers from people were offering me, I mean, I think I was offered full professorships at North Carolina, in Chapel Hill, and also at Purdue, I think, and I had to make a decision as to what I should do. I mean, I was promoted to associate professor at Caltech, surprisingly early, but anyway, the question is, where should I spend the rest of my life? Should I be a mathematician? Should I be a computer scientist? By this time, I had learned that there was actually possible to do mathematical work as a computer scientist. I had analysis of algorithms to do, so what would be a permanent home? And I had visited Stanford. I gave a talk about my left to right parsing. I discovered a theorem about it sitting in one of the student dormitories, Stern Hall, or there was dormitory the night before I gave the lecture. Anyway, I came up there. I liked George Forsythe very much. I liked the people that I met here very much. And so I was thinking Stanford would be a nice place, but also there were other places too that I wanted to check out carefully, and so I was also trying to think about what to do, long term for my permanent home. I don't like to move, so I thought so my model of my life was going to be that I was going to make one move in my lifetime to a place where I had tenure and I would stay there forever, and so I wanted to check all these things out. So I started to, so I was confronted with this aspect as well. I was signed up to be an ACM lecturer in ACM National Lecture program for 2 or 3 weeks in February of 1967, which meant that I give a list of 3 talks, and each ACM chapter or university that wants to have a speaker, they coordinate so that I have a schedule. I go from city to city every day. You probably did the same thing about then, and and Stanford and Berkeley were on this list, as well as quite a few schools in the East, so that was 3 weeks in February where I was giving talks about different things about programming languages mostly. And when I'm at Caltech, I've got to be either preparing my class lectures or typing my book and getting it done. I'm in the middle of typing volume 4 chapter 4 at this time, which is the second part of volume 2. So I'm about 1/3 of the way into volume 2. Okay, so that's why I don't have time to do research. If I get a new idea, if I'm saying here's a problem that ought to be solved, when am I going to do it? Maybe on the airplane. And as you know, when you're a lecturer, every day goes the same way. You get up at your hotel, and you get on the plane. Somebody meets you at noon, and you go out to the faculty for lunch, and then they have small talk. They ask you the same questions. Where are you going to be tomorrow, Don? And so on. And there's you give your lecture in the afternoon, and there's a party in the evening, and then you go to your hotel, and the next morning you go off to the next city. After 3 weeks of this, I got really not very good. So I skipped out. In one case, there was a snowstorm in Atlanta, so I skipped my talk in Atlanta, and I stayed an extra day. But anyway, this was I'm trying to give you the flavor of this. But on this trip in February, also, it turned out to be very fruitful, because one of my stops was in Cornell, where Peter Wegner was a visiting professor, and we went out for a hike that weekend to talk about the main topic in programming language in those days is how do you define the semantics of a programming language? What's a good way to formalize the meaning of the sentences in that language? When someone writes a string of symbols, we want to say exactly what that means, and do it in a way that we can prove interesting results about, and make sure that that we've translated it correctly, and there were a lot of ideas floating in the air at the time, and I had come up with, and I had been, thinking of how I'm presenting it in the art of computer programming, and I said, well, there were 2 basic ways to do this. One is top down, where you have the context telling you what to do. So you start out and you say, this is supposed to be a program. What does a program mean? And then a program tells the things inside the program what they're supposed to mean. The other is bottom up, where you just start with one symbol. This is a number 1, and say, oh, this means 1. Then you have a plus sign and 1 plus 2, and then you build up from the bottom and say that means 3. And so we had a bottom-up version of semantics and a top-down version of semantics. And I said, well, of course, and also Peter Wegner says to me, Don, why don't you use both, both top-down and bottom-up? Or they have the synthesized attributes from the bottom up and the inherited attributes that come down from the environment. And I said, well, this is obviously impossible. You get into circular reasoning. You can't define something in terms of itself. And so we were talking about this, and after 10 minutes, I realized I was shouting to him because, in fact, not only because I was realizing that he was absolutely right, that you could do it both ways, and define the things in a way that they would not interfere with each other. That certain aspects of a meaning could come from the top and other aspects from the bottom, and that this actually made a beautiful combination.
So, Don, we were speaking about semantics of programming languages, and you were shouting at Peter Wegner.
I'm shouting at Peter Wegner because it turns out that there is a beautiful way to combine the top-down and bottom-up approaches simultaneously when you're defining semantics. So this is happening on a weekend as we're hiking at Cornell in a beautiful park by icicles. I can remember the scene because this was kind of an aha moment, that doesn't happen to you very often in your life. And people tell me now no one's allowed in that park in February because it's too risky that you're going to slide and hurt yourself. But it was when all of a sudden it occurred to me that this might be possible. But I don't have time to do research. And I have to go on and give more lectures. Well, I find myself the next week at Stanford University speaking to the students, to the graduate students. I gave one of my regular lecture, and then there was an hour saying, the students ask questions to the visitor. And there was a student there named Susan Graham, who of course has turned out to be a very distinguished professor at Berkeley and editor of Transactions on Programming Languages and Systems. She asked me a question, Don, how do you think would be a good way to define semantics of programming languages? And so here was a chance. So here in the back of my mind, through that week, I had been tossing around this idea that Peter and I had talked about the week before, and so I said, well, let's try to sketch out a simple language and try to define its semantics. And on the blackboard, in response to Susan's questions, and then we would erase and go and try things, and some things wouldn't work. But for the next 15 or 20 minutes, I tried to write down something that I had never written down before, but was sort of in the back of my mind, how to define a very simple algebraic language and convert it into a very simple machine language, which we invented, on the spot, to be an abstract but fairly simple computer. And then we would try to write out the formal semantics for this, so that I could write a few lines in this algebraic language, and then we could parse it and see exactly what the semantics would be, which would be the machine language program. And of course, there must have been a lot of bugs in it, but this was the way I had to do research at that time. I had a chance, while I'm in front of the students, to think about the research problem that was just beginning to gel. And who knows, how bad it it was fouled out. But this was, on the other hand, being a teacher, that's when you get your thoughts in order best. If you're only talking to yourself, you don't organize your thoughts with as much discipline. So it probably was also not a bad way to do research. And I didn't get a chance to think about it when I got home to Caltech, because I'm typing up art of computer programming when I'm at home, and I'm being an editor, and I'm teaching my classes the rest of the time at Caltech. But then in April, I happened to be giving a lecture in Grenoble, and a Frenchman, Louis Bollier, asked me something about how one might define semantics in another sort of a bull session in Grenoble in France, and that was my second chance to think about this problem when I was talking with him there. So I was stealing time, from the other things. Now, that wasn't the only thing going on in '67. So I wasn't only thinking of what to do with my future life and editing journals. So, and I'm also teaching a class at Caltech for sophomores. It's an all-year class, sort of introduction to abstract mathematics. And while I was looking at a problem, we had a visitor at Caltech named Trevor what's his last name? Evans. Trevor Evans, who he and I were discussing how to work from axioms and to prove theorems from axioms. So this is a basic thing in abstract mathematics. Somebody sets down an axiom like the associative law, and then it says that if parenthesis AB times C is equal to A times parenthesis BC. That's an axiom. And I was looking at other axioms that were sort of random. And one of the things I asked my students in the class was, I was trying to teach the sophomores how to do mini research problems, and so I gave them axioms which I called the axioms of a grope, and they were supposed to develop grope theory. They were supposed to grope for theorems. Of course, the mathematical theory well developed is a group, which I've been teaching them, axioms of groups, and one of them is the associative law. Another axiom of a group is that an element times its inverse is equal to the identity, and another axiom is that the identity times anything is this, identity times x is x. So groups have axioms, and we learned that in the class how to derive consequences of these axioms that weren't exactly obvious at the beginning. So I said, okay, let's make a grope. And I think the axiom for a grope was something like x times the quantity yx was equal to y. And so I give them this axiom, and I say to the class, what can you derive? Can you find all gropes that have 5 elements? Can you find can you prove any theorems about normal subgroups or whatever it is? To make up a theory, and as a class we came back in a week and saying what theorems could you come up with, and then people and we tried to imagine ourselves in the shoes of an inventor of a mathematical theory, starting with axioms. Well, Trevor Evans was there, and he showed me how to define what we call the free grope, which is the set of all. If you have no, it can be infinite, but you take all strings of letters, all formulas. Is it possible to tell whether one formula can be proved equal to the other formula just by using this one axiom of the grope, the x times yx equals y? And he showed me a very nice way to solve that problem, because he'd been working on word problems in what's called universal algebra, study of axiom systems. So while I'm looking at Trevor Evans' solution to this problem, so you see, this problem arose in connection with my teaching of the class. So I look at Trevor Evans' solution to this problem. I realized that I could develop an actual method that would work with axioms in general without thinking, that a machine could figure out. The machine could start out with the axioms of group theory, and after a small amount of computation, it could come up with a set of 10 consequences of those axioms that would be enough to decide the word problem for free groups. And the machine was doing it. We didn't need a mathematician there to prove, to say, oh, now try combining this formula and this formula. With the technique I learned from Trevor Evans, and then a little extra twist that I put on it, I could set the machine going on axioms, and it would automatically know which consequences of these things, which things to plug in, would be potentially fruitful. And if we were lucky, like we were in the case of group theory axioms, it would finally get to the end and say, now there's nothing more can be proved. I've got enough. I've got a complete set of reductions that will take. If you apply these reductions and none of them applies, you've got it. It relates to AI techniques of the expert systems in a way. So this idea came to me as I'm teaching the basic math class, and the students in this class were supposed to do a term paper in the third quarter. Everybody worked on this, and one of the best students in the class, Peter Bendix, chose to do his term paper by implementing the algorithm that I had sketched on the blackboard in one of the lectures that time. And so we could do experiments during the spring of '67, trying out a whole bunch of different kind of axioms and seeing which ones the machine would solve, and which ones it would keep spinning and generating more and more reductions that seemed to go without limit. And then we figured out in some cases how we could introduce new axioms that would bring the whole thing back down again. And so we're doing a lot of experiments on that kind of thing, but I don't have time to sit down at home and work out the theory for. But I knew it had lots of possibilities. And so so here I had attribute grammars coming up in February, and these reduction systems coming up in March, and I'm supposed to be grinding out volume 2 of Art of Computer Programming. I sent the text of volume 1 had gone to Addison Wesley the previous year, and the copy editor had sent me back corrections and told me, Don, this isn't good writing. You've got to change this. You teach me Addison Wesley House style, the page proofs started to come. So I had gone through galley proofs, but now it was time to get page proofs for volume 1, and volume 1 was published in January of 1968, but the page proofs started to be available in the spring also.
Yeah, so it's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer.
Right. And so there's a conference in April. There's a conference in Norway on simulation languages. That was another of the things I've been working on at Burroughs. We had a language called SOL, Simulation Oriented Language, which was an improvement of the state of the art in system simulation, what they call discrete simulation languages. And there was an international conference held in Norway by the people who had invented the Simula language, which wasn't very well known, but they organized this conference, and I went I went to that, visiting Paris and Grenoble on my way because Maurice Nivat and I had also become friends, and his thesis was on theory of context-free grammars, and nobody in France would read it. And so he found a guy in America who would appreciate his work, and so he came out, and we spent some time together in '66 getting to know each other and talking about context-free grammar research. So I visited him in Paris, and then I went to Grenoble, and then went to Norway for this conference on simulation languages, where I presented a paper about SOL and learned about simula, and so on. Then my parents and Jill's parents are taking care of our kids while we're in Europe during this time in April. I'm scheduled in June to lecture at a summer school in Copenhagen, an international summer school, and I'm giving lectures about how to parse what's called top-down parsing. The LL of K is the terminology that developed after these lectures. This was a topic that I did put in my draft of Chapter 10. It was something that I understood well enough that I didn't have to publish it at the time. So I gave it for the first time in these lectures in June in Copenhagen. And that was a 1-week series of lectures with several lectures every day, 5 days, to be given there. And the summer school met for 2 weeks, and I was supposed to speak in the second week of that summer school. All right, so what happened then in May, I had a massive bleeding ulcer, and I was in the hospital, and I, my body gave out. I was just doing all this stuff, and I couldn't take it. So I learned about myself. I had a wonderful doctor who showed me his textbook about ulcers. At that time, they didn't know that ulcers are related to this bacteria. It was just, it was, as far as they were concerned, it was just acid.
Stress.
Yeah, and people would get, operations so that their stomach wouldn't produce so much acid and things like that. But anyway, he showed me his textbook, and his textbook described the typical ulcer patient, and what other people call the type A personality, and it just described me, to a T. All of the things that were there. I was an automaton. I mean, I've been all my life, but pretty much a test-taking machine, and I saw a goal and I put myself to it and I worked on it and pushed it through. And I didn't say no to people when they said, "Don, can you do this for me?" And so at this point, and I saw I could all of a sudden get to understand that I had this problem, that I shouldn't try to do the impossible stuff. And the doctor, why I say it's so wonderful, because doctors usually would talk down to patients and they keep their secrets to themselves. But here he let me look at his textbook, and he said, and so that I could know that he wasn't just telling me something to make me feel good, but he would, that I had access to anything that I wanted to know about my condition. And so I wrote a letter to my publisher, framed in black, saying, I'm not going to be able to get the manuscript of Volume 2 to you this year. I'm sorry. I'm not supposed to work for the next 3 weeks. And in fact, you can tell exactly where this was. I was writing a part of Volume 2, and I was when the ulcer sort of happened, when the started to burst or whatever, I was working out the answer to a problem about greatest common divisors that goes in about in the middle of volume 2, and it was a exercise where the answer had a lot of cases to it, so it takes about a page and a half to explain the answer. But it was a problem that needed to be studied, and nobody had studied it before, and I was working at it, and all of a sudden, bingo. But the reason you can find it is if you look in the index to volume 2 under brute force, it refers you to a page, an answer page, and I was solving this problem by brute force, and so you look at that page, you can see exactly what exercise I was working on, and then I put it away, and I didn't, I had only solved half of the exercise before I could work on it again a few weeks later. So I went into the hospital. It wasn't too bad, but the blood subsided. I took iron pills and got ready, and I could still go to Copenhagen to give my lectures in June. However, the first week were supposed to be lectures by Niklaus Wirth, and the second week was supposed to be lectures by me. But Klaus had just gone on a around-the-world tour with his wife and had come down with dysentery in India and was extremely ill and had to cancel his lectures. So I was supposed to go on in the first week instead. Now, I was stealing time so bad. I hadn't really prepared my lectures. I said, "Oh, I have a week. I'll go to Copenhagen, listen to Klaus, and I'll prepare my lectures." And I hadn't prepared. So I'm talking about stuff that has never been written down before, never been developed to the students, and I get to Copenhagen with one day to prepare for this week of lectures. Well, one thing in Copenhagen, there's wonderful parks, all over the city, and I sat down under a big tree in one of those parks on that first day, and I thought of enough things to say in my first 2 lectures. And on the second day, I gave the lectures, and I sat down under that tree, and I worked out the lectures for the next day. And these lectures became my eventual paper called Top-Down Syntax Analysis. That was the story of the first part of June. Second part of June, I'm going to a conference in Oxford, one of the first conferences on discrete mathematics. And there I'm presenting my paper on the new method that I had discovered about what's now called the Knuth-Bendix algorithm, the word problems in universal algebra. And after I finished my lectures at Copenhagen, I had time to write the paper that I was giving at Oxford the following week. And so there at Oxford, I meet a lot of other people and get more stimulated about combinatorial research, which I can't do. Come back to Stanford. Come back to Caltech, and I'm working as a consultant as well. I resigned from 10 editorial boards at this time. No more ACM Journal, no more communications. I gave up all of the editorships that I was on, and in order to cut down my workload. The next time I had, and I started working again on volume 2, to where I left off at the time of the ulcer. But I would be careful to go to sleep and keep a regular schedule. In the fall, I went to a conference in Santa Barbara, and a conference on combinatorial mathematics in Santa Barbara, and that was the first chance to be away from Caltech, so away from my teaching duties, away from having to type out of computer programming, and so that's where I had 3 days to sit on the beach and develop the theory of attribute grammars, this idea of top-down and bottom-up. And I cut out of the whole conference. I didn't go to any of the talks. I just sat on the beach and worked out a theory of attribute grammars. It turned out I wasn't that interested in most of the talks, although I met people that became lifelong friends at the meals, and we talked about things offline. But the formal talks themselves, I was getting disappointed with mathematical talks. I found myself in most lectures on mathematics that I heard in 1966 and 67. I sat in the back row and I said, "So what? So what?" Computer science was becoming much more exciting to me, and so when I finally made my career decision as to where to go, I had four main choices. One was stay at Caltech. They offered me a full professor in mathematics. I could go to Harvard as a full professor in applied science, which meant computer science. I mean, that was as close as you could get to computer science there. At Harvard, my job would have been to build up a computer science department there. Harvard was, in Floyd's term, it was an advanced backwater at that point in time for computer science, and Caltech as well. Because the Caltech and Harvard are so good at physics and chemistry, biology, they're thinking of computers as being there
to somebody else's.
because they can help physicists and chemists and biologists, but they didn't think of it as having problems of its own interest. And Stanford, where we had the best group of computer scientists in the world already there, and knowing that computer science had a great future, and also the best students in the world there to work with. So it was already, the department was already built up. I could come to Stanford and be one of the boys and do computer science instead of argue for computer science and try to do barnstorming. And Berkeley was the fourth place, where I also I admired Berkeley very much as probably the greatest all-around institution for covering everything. Stanford would cover everything Stanford covered. It covered well, but it didn't have a professor of Sanskrit, and Berkeley has a professor of Sanskrit, that kind of thing. But I was worried about Berkeley because Ronald Reagan was governor, and I couldn't, Stanford was a private school, wouldn't subject to the whims of politicians so much as the University of California. And then Stanford had this great other thing where the faculty can live on campus, and so I knew that I could come to Stanford the rest of my life I would be able to bike to work. I wouldn't have to do any commuting. So, and Forsyth was a wonderful person, and all the group at Stanford were great, and the students were best. So it was almost a no-brainer for why I finally came to Stanford, and my offer from Stanford came through in February of '68, which was the end. The other three had already come in earlier, but I was waiting for Stanford before I made my final decision. And in February of '68, I finally got the offer from Stanford. It was a month after Volume 1 had been published, and George said, "Oh yes, everybody's all smiles now." But '67, you see, was
everyone was all smiles because they had gone out on a limb to offer you a full professorship, or
because the committees were saying this guy is just 30 years old.
Yeah, that's what I meant by going out on a
yeah,
limb. Yeah,
right. And I was born in 38. This is '68, in January '68. But then when they looked at the book, they said, "Oh, there's some credibility here."
Yeah.
So that helped me. But so I got through '67 and learned how to slack off a little bit, right? And I've always felt after that and hearing many other stories of people, when did they get these special insights that turn out to be important, in their research thing, and it was very rarely in a settled time of their life where they had comfortable living conditions and a good the word is escaping me now, but anyway, luxury, set up a nice office space and good lighting and so on. No, the people are working in a garret. They're starving. They got kids screaming. There's war going on or something. But that's when they get a lot of the almost every breakthrough ideas. So I always wondered, if you wanted to set up a think tank where you were going to get the most productivity out of your scientists, wouldn't you have to, not exactly torture them, but deprive them of things? It's not sustainable. Still, looking back, that was a time when I did as much science as I could, as well as trying to fill all my other obligations.
Don, to go back to the Stanford move, the couple questions come up because I was around, and I remember sitting in George Forsyth's office, just a handful of us people considering the appointment of this young guy from Caltech, who had this wonderful outline of books. And one of the things that we were discussing was Don Knuth wanted us to also hire Bob Floyd. It turns out that hiring Bob Floyd was a wonderful idea. Bob Floyd was magnificent, but it hadn't occurred to us until you brought it up, and then we did it. Can you go into that story?
Yeah, because Bob was a very special person to me throughout this period. As I said, I'd been reading the literature about programming languages avidly, and when I was asked to write a book about it in '62, I knew that there were these people had written nice papers, but nobody knew how to sort out the weeds from the tares from the wheat. So in the early days, like by 1964, my strong opinion was that 5 good papers about programming languages had ever been written, and 4 of them were by Bob Floyd. I met Bob the first time in summer of '62 when I was working on this compiler this Fortran compiler for UNIVAC, and at the end of the summer went to the ACM conference in Syracuse, New York, and Bob was there, and we hit it off very well from right away. He was showing me his strange idea that you could prove a computer program correct. Something I had never occurred to me. I mean, I said I was a programmer in one room, and I was a mathematician in another room. Mathematicians prove things. Programmers write code, and they hope it works, and they twiddle it until it works. But Bob's saying, no, you don't have to twiddle. You can take a program and you can give a mathematical proof that it works. He was way ahead of me. There were very few people had ever conceived of putting those two worlds together at the time. And
McCarthy was one of them.
McCarthy, exactly, right. John and Bob were probably the. I don't know if there was anybody in Europe yet had seen this, right. And but Bob tells me his thoughts about this. When I meet him in his conference in Syracuse. And so then I went to visit him a year later when I was in Massachusetts, at the crisis meeting with my publishers. He lived there, and so I went and spent a couple of days in Topsfield where he lived. And then we shared ideas about sorting. And then we had a really exciting correspondence over the next time, where letters go back and forth, each one trying to trump the other about coming up with a better idea about something that's now called sorting networks. And Bob and I developed a theory of sorting networks between us in a correspondence that we were thinking at the time, this looks like Leibniz writing to Bernoulli, in the old days, the scientists trying to develop a new theory. We had a very exciting time working on these letters, and every time I would send a letter off to Bob and thinking that, okay, now this is the last result, and that he would come back with a brand new idea and make me work harder again to come up with the next step in our development of this theory. So we weren't talking only about programming languages. We were talking also about a variety of algorithms. We found we had lots of common interests. He came out to visit me a couple times in California, and I visited him. So so when I was making my career decision, I said, "Hey, Bob, wouldn't it be nice if we could both end up at the same place?" And I wrote him a letter, probably the same letter where I was describing to him my idea about left to right parsing. As soon as I discovered it, I wrote immediately. I wrote immediately to Bob a 12-page letter, ideas of left to right parsing, after I had come up with the idea, and then he comes back and says, "Oh, bravo! And did you think about this?" And so we had this going on, and then at the beginning of '67, I said, Bob, why don't we think about trying to get into the same place together? What is your take on the different places in the world? At that time, he was at Carnegie. He had left Computer Associates and spent, I think, 2 years at Carnegie. And he was enjoying it there, and he was teaching. He was introducing new things into the curriculum there, he wrote me this letter assessing all of the schools at the time and the way he thought that their development of computer science was. And that's when I quoted him a minute ago, saying Harvard was an advanced backwater. That comes out of that letter that he was describing the way he looked at things. And at the end of the letter, he says, I think I'd already mentioned that I was that Stanford was my current number one, but I wasn't totally sure. And at the end, he ended up concurring, and he said if I would go there and he could go there, the chances are he would go there too. I presented this to Forsyth, saying, why don't we try to make it a package deal? And this meant that they had to give up 2 professors to replace us with. They couldn't get 2 new billets for us, and so it was a lot of work on Stanford's part, but it did develop, and we had so, except that you had to lose two other good people. I think Bob and I did all right for the department, and.
Maybe that was your first great service to our department, was recruiting Bob Floyd.
Well, I don't know. I did have to work a little bit. The year after I got here, to my surprise, they had appointed him as an associate professor, but me as a full professor. And it was understandable because he didn't have a PhD. He had been a child prodigy, and I think he had gotten into graduate school like at age 17 or something like this, and then dropped out to become a full-time programmer. So he didn't have the academic credentials, although he had all the best papers in the field. And the thing that finally, so I had to meet with the provost and so on, saying, well, you know, this is it's time to promote him to full professor. And the thing that clinched it was that he was the only person who had gotten, this was 1969, he was the only person that had been invited to give keynote addresses in 2 sessions of the International Congress of the Congress in Ljubljana in
71.
In 71. Okay, yeah. So, all right. So he you know, so that helped to.
That was IFIPS.
IFIPS. Yeah, information processing.
So Don, maybe we could just say a little more about Bob and his life at Stanford.
Right. So as it turned out, when we got together, we couldn't collaborate quite as well as when we were writing letters. And this also, I noticed this was true in other cases. It's like sometimes I could advise my students better when I was on sabbatical than when we were having weekly meetings because we you know, it's not easy to work face to face all the time, but rather sometimes offline instead of online. I told you my experience with Marshall Hall, that I couldn't think in his presence, and you know, I mean, I have to confess that there are some women computer scientists that when I'm in their presence, I think only of their brown eyes, and I have to, you know, I love their research, but I'm wired in certain ways that make it mean that we should write our joint papers by male or by female. Anyway, no. So anyway, we wrote. We did a lot of joint work in the early '70s, but also it turned out that when Bob became chair of the department, I'm not sure exactly when that was. Probably right after my sabbatical.
1972.
Yeah,
actually.
Yeah, because I went on leave of absence for a year in Norway, and then I came back, and Bob was chair of the department, and he took that job extremely seriously and worked on it to such an extent that he couldn't do any research very much at all during those 3 or 4 years when he was chair. Was it maybe, I don't know how many years, 5 years.
Bob, I started in being chair in '76.
76. So okay, so it was 4 years. Okay, and that included the very detailed planning, all aspects of our new building. So when he came back, then he had 2 years of sabbatical. That's one credit that you get as being a. So there was a break in our joint collaboration, and afterwards he never quite caught up to the leading edge of the same research topics that I was in. So we would work on things occasionally, but not at all the way we had been previously. We did, you know, we wrote a paper that we're quite pleased with at the end of the '80s. So, you know, but it was not the kind of thing that we imagined originally, that we'd always be, you know, so in each other's backyard. In fact, I'm a very bad co-worker. You can't count on me to do anything because I get, you know, it takes me a while to finish stuff, and I think of something else, and so how can anybody rely on me as being able to go with their agenda? So Bob during the '70s came up with a lot of ideas that were like his method for halftone for making gray level pictures that is in all the printers of the world now, and things that was done completely independently. I didn't even know about it until a couple of years after he had come up with these inventions. But I'm dedicating a book to Bob. My collected works are being published in 8 volumes, and the 7th volume is selected papers on design of algorithms, and that one is dedicated to Bob Floyd because a lot of the joint work we did occurs in that volume, and he's one of the few people in my life that really I consider one of my teachers, that are the gurus that inspired me on. Yeah.
So Don, I'm going to call that the end of your first period at Stanford, and wanted to move into some questions about what I call your second Stanford period, and this is a very different. I've sort of delineated this as a very different time. This is a time I saw you shifting gears, and I couldn't believe what was happening. You became, in a solitary way, the world's greatest programmer. It was your engineering phase. This was TeX and METAFONT. And all of a sudden you disappeared into just miles of code and fantastic coding ideas just pouring out, plus your engineering. We were in the new building and you were running back and forth from your office to where this new printing machine was installed, and you'd be debugging it with your eyes and with your symbols and pulling your hair out of your head because it wasn't working right and all that. You were just, it's what the National Academy of Engineering would call an engineer. Yeah. Tell me about that period of your life.
Okay, well, it ties in with several things, and there was a year that you didn't see me when I was up at McCarthy's lab.
Well, I heard all about it.
Starting this, but one of the first papers that I collaborated with Bob Floyd on in 1970 was called having to do with avoiding go-to statements. There was a revolutionary new way to write programs came along in the 70s called structured programming, and it was a different way than we were used to when I had done all my compilers in the 60s. and Bob and I were, a lot of our earliest conversations at Stanford were saying, well, let's get on the bandwagon for this. Let's understand structured programming, do it right. And so one of our first papers was to do what we thought was, a better approach to this ideas of structured programming than some people had been taking. Some people had misunderstood that if you just get rid of go-to statements and you have a structured program, and it's like saying zero population growth. You have a numerical goal, but you don't have you don't change the structure. So people were figuring out a way to write programs that were just as messy as before, but without using the word "go-to" in them. And we said no. Here's what the real issues are. And so Bob and I were working on this, and so this is going on, and we're teaching students how to write program at Stanford, but we had never really written more than a textbook code ourselves in this style. So here we are, being full professors, telling people how to do it, having never done it ourselves, except in really sterile cases without any real-world constraints. So, so I probably was itching. I mean, thank you for calling me the world's greatest programmer. I mean, I was always calling myself that in my head. I mean, I love programming, and so I love to think that I was doing it as well as anybody. But the fact is, the new way of programming was something that I didn't have time to put much effort into.
The emphasis in my comment was on the solitary. You were a single programmer doing all this. No team.
That's right. Yeah. No. I was. As I said, it's hard for me to to go into somebody else's, to have somebody else doing the drumming. I had to march to my. I mean, I had the art of computer programming too, so I could never be. I could never be a reliable part of a team that I wasn't the head of, I guess. But I did have. I did first have to get into that mode because I was forced to. I was chair of of a committee at Stanford for our Stanford the university reports, and we put out lots and lots of reports from all phases of the department through these years, and we had a big mailing list and people were also trading their reports with us, and we had to keep we had to have a massive bookkeeping system just to keep the correspondence, and so that the secretaries in charge of it could know who had paid for their reports, who were we sharing with, and all this administrative type of work had to be done, and it seemed like just a small matter of programming to do this. I had a grad student who volunteered to do this as his master's project, to write a program that would take care of all of the administrative chores of the Stanford Tech Reports distribution. And he turned in his term paper, and I looked at it superficially, and I gave him an A on it, and he graduated with his master's degree. And a week later, the secretary called me up and said, "Don, we're having a little trouble with this program. Can you take a look at it for us?" And the program was running up at the AI lab, which I hadn't visited very often. I went up there and took a look at the program, and I got to page 5 of the program, and I said, this is interesting. Let me make a copy of this page. I'm going to show it to my class. It's the first time I saw where you change one symbol on the page and you can make the program run 50 times faster. You know, he had misunderstood a sorting algorithm. So this was, I thought this was great. So then I turned to the next page, and he has a searching algorithm on there for binary search, and I said, oh, he made a very interesting error here. Make a copy of this page so I can show my class next time I teach it the wrong way to do binary search. Well, then I got to page 8 or 9, and I realized that the way he had written his program was hopelessly wrong. It had worked. He had written a program that would only work on the test case, on the test case that he had used in his report for the master's thesis. That was based on a database of size 3 or something like this, and if you increase the database to 4, all the structures would break down. I mean, it was based on it was the most weird thing. I would never conceive of it in my life. He would assume that the whole database was being maintained by the text editor, and the text editor would generate an index of the way the thing did. And anyway, it was a completely hopeless. There was no way to fix the program. I thought I was going to spend the weekend and give it to the secretary on Monday, and she could work on it. There was no way. So I had to spend a month writing a program that summer. I think it was probably 76. 75, 76, to cover up for my terrible error of giving this guy an A and without grading it, without seeing that he had really, that the paper, the report that he had made it look like his program was working, but it only worked on that one case. It was really pathetic, and so I said, okay, I'll use structured programming. I'll write up. I'll do it right. This is my chance to do structured programming. I'll get learning experience out of it, and I got a good appreciation for writing administrative type programming. I used to think it was trivial. It was nothing. There was a lot to it, and after a month, I had a structured program that would do Stanford reports, and could install that and get back to the rest of my life. Meanwhile, I'd been up at the AI lab, and I met the people up there, got to know like Leland Smith, who was a great musician professor. And Leland Smith told me about a problem that he had. He was typesetting music. And he says, I got a piece of music, and it's got, it maybe has 50 bars of music. I have to decide when to turn the page. And I know how many notes are in each bar of the music, and I know you know how much can fit on a page. But I like to have the breaks come out right. Is there any algorithms that could work for this? And he described the problem with me as you have a sequence of numbers of how many notes there are, and try to find a way to break it into lines and pages in a decent way. And so I looked at the problem. I said, "Hey, Leland, this is great. It's a nice application of something we in computer science call the dynamic programming algorithm method. And look, here's how dynamic programming can be used to solve this problem." And then I'm teaching Stanford's problem seminar the next fall, and I gave that. It came up in class where I would show the students, look how we have this music problem and we can solve it with dynamic programming. One of the students, I don't remember who it was, raised his hand and said, you could also use that to text, to English, to printing books. You could say, instead of notes into bars, you could also say letters and words into lines and make paragraphs, choosing good line breaks that way. And I said, hey, that's cool. You're right. Okay. Now, then comes in the mail the proof sheets for Volume 2, the second edition of Volume 2, which is now going out for its second. I mean, I had changed a lot of pages in Volume 2 of Art of Computer Programming, and so I got page proofs for the new edition. During the 70s, the printing technology changed drastically. It was printing was done with hot lead in the 60s, but they switched over to using film in the 70s. My whole book had been completely retypeset with a different technology, and the new fonts looked terrible. The subscripts were in a different style from the large letters, for example, and the spacing was very bad. And you can look at books printed in the early 70s, and it turns out that if it wasn't simple, well, almost everything looked atrocious in those days, and I couldn't stand to see my books so ugly. I mean, I spent all this time working on it, and then I can't be proud of something that looks hopeless. And I'm tearing out my hair. I went to Boston again, and they said, "Oh, well, we know these people in Poland. They can imitate the fonts that you had in the old hot lead days." And it's probably not legal, but we can probably sneak it through without the copyright problems of the fonts. They'll try to do the best they can and do better. So then they come back to me with at the beginning of '77 with the new version done with these Polish fonts, which are supposed to solve the problem, and they are just hopelessly bad. At the same time, the very same time, it's February of '77. I'm on the Stanford's comprehensive exam committee, and we're deciding what is the reading list going to be for next year's comp. And Pat Winston had just come out with a new book on artificial intelligence, and the proofs of it were just being done at III Corporation in Southern California, at Fredkin's company. They had a new way of typesetting using lasers, and all digital, all dots of ink instead of photographic images and lenses. They were using algorithms, bits, through it. And I looked at these galley proofs of Winston's book, and I knew it was just bits, but they looked gorgeous. They looked absolutely as good as anything I'd ever seen printed by any method. And you see, by this time I was working at the AI lab where we had the Xerox graphics printer, which did bits at about 120 dots per inch, and it looked interesting, but it didn't look beautiful by any stretch of the imagination. Here, with I think this was 1,000 dots per inch at III, it was, you couldn't tell the difference, and it was like, you know, I come from Wisconsin, and in Wisconsin we never eat margarine. Margarine was illegal to bring into the state of Wisconsin unless you didn't color it, and so I'm raised on butter, and it's the same thing here. With typography, I'm thinking, okay, digital typography would have to be like margarine; it couldn't be the real thing. But no, there's no. Our eyes don't see any difference when you got enough dots to the inch. So. A week later, I'm flying down with Les Ernest to Southern California to III and finding out what's going on there. How can we get this machine and do it? And meanwhile, I had planned to have my sabbatical year, 77, 78. I was going to spend my sabbatical year in Chile.
Don, can I interrupt you just a second and say that I don't know if Fredkin was still involved with III at that time, but III never gets enough credit for those really revolutionary ideas. Not just those ideas, but the high-speed graphics ideas.
Oh yeah, and that's when I met Rich Chappelle down there, and he's working on character recognition problems and things and they had been doing it actually for a long time. I mean, on microfilm before doing Winston's book. This was the second generation. They were first they had been using the digital technology for at really high resolutions on microfilm. And so many other things going on. And Fredkin is a
well, right at the beginning, Fredkin revolutionized film reading.
Yeah.
Using the PDP-1.
Yeah.
Anyway, I interrupt you. You're on your way to Chile.
No, but his life is 10 times as interesting as mine. I'm sure that every time I hear more about Ed, as just another, he's an incredible person. We got to get 20 oral history.
Well, I think Ed may be a subject for one of these oral histories of a computer history museum.
So anyway, I canceled my sabbatical plan for Chile. I wrote to them saying, I'm sorry, I just decided to change. Instead of working on Volume 4 during my sabbatical, I'm going to work on typography. I just can't, I've got to solve this problem of getting typesetting right, and it's only zeros and ones. I can get those dots on the page, and so I've got to write this program, so that's when I became an engineer.
Well, how much of the I'm going to let you go on with this, but I just wanted to ask a question in the middle here. Just related to myself, actually.
Yeah.
How much of this motivation to do tech related to your just wanting to get back to being a programmer? And there's life was going on in too abstract a way, and you wanted to get back to being a programmer and learning what the problems were, or the joy of programming.
It's a very interesting hypothesis because really you could see that I had this. The way I approached this CS reports problem the year before was an indication of this, that I did want to sink my teeth into something other than a toy problem, and it wasn't real large, but it wasn't real small either. So it's true that I probably had this craving, but I had a stronger craving to finish Volume 4, and I did sincerely believe that it was only going to take me a year.
Well, maybe Volume 4 wasn't quite ready. Maybe it was
this is true.
Still cooking.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. In 1975 and 76, you can check it out. Look at the Journal of the ACM, look at the SIAM Journal of Computing, look at well, there's also SIAM Review, and there's math journals, combinatorial journals, communications of the ACM for that matter. You'll find more than half of those articles are things that belong in Volume 4. There's the whole, it was, people were discovering things right and left that I knew deserved to be done right in Volume 4. Volume 4 is about combinatorial algorithms. Combinatorial algorithms was such a small topic in 1962 when I made that chapter 7 of my outline, that Johan Dahl asked me when I was in Norway. He said, "How did you ever think of putting in a chapter about combinatorial algorithms in 1962?" And I said, "Well, the only reason was that was the part I thought was most fun. I really enjoyed writing like this program for Bose that I did overnight. You know, it was a combinatorial program. So I had to have this chapter just for fun. But there wasn't almost nothing known about it at the time. Well, people will talk about combinatorial algorithms. Nowadays, they usually use the word combinatorial in a negative way, pejorative sense, instead of the way I look at it. They say, "Oh, the combinatorics is going to kill you." The combinatorial is, means that it's exploding. You can't handle it. It's a huge problem. The way I look at it is, combinatorial means this is where you've got to use some art. You've got to be really skillful in order to, because one good idea can save you 6 orders of magnitude, make your program run 1,000,000 times faster. So people are coming up with these ideas all the time, and so for me, the combinatorial explosion was the explosion of research. Not the problems exploding, but the ideas were exploding, and so there was that much more to cover. So it's true that I also, in the back of my mind, I'm scared stiff that I can't write Volume 4 anymore, and so maybe I'm waiting for it to simmer down. I mean, somebody did say to me once, after I solved the problem of typesetting, maybe I would, start to look at binding or something, because I had to have something else to some other reason. I've certainly seen enough graduate student procrastinators in my life so maybe I was in denial. But
anyway, you headed into this major engineering
as
project.
far as I knew, that though it was going to take me a year, and I was going to work. So I was going to enjoy having a year of solving this, of writing this kind of a program. Yeah, and then I was, and the program was going to be just for me and my secretary Phyllis, my super secretary Phyllis. And I was going to teach her how to do it. She loved to do technical typing, and I could write my books, and she could put them. She could make them at her dotting the I's and crossing T's and spit and polish that she did on my math papers when she always typed my math paper.